The 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean in March 2011 created a rarefied atmosphere, both literally and metaphorically, aboard British Airways Flight 447, where the complexities of human social hierarchies played out in a microcosm suspended between continents. Caroline Whitmore adjusted her Navy tie with the military precision that had characterized her 15 years as a senior first-class flight attendant, each movement reflecting decades of British cultural conditioning about propriety, decorum, and the meticulous maintenance of social distinctions that defined not just profession, but existential identity. By the age of 42, Caroline had transformed air service into an aristocratic art form, cultivating an almost preternatural expertise in decoding the subtle symbols that separated the genuine elite from the aspirational pretense. Her education at private schools in Surrey had planted seeds of refinement that blossomed into a career in which she served as the unofficial guardian of the civilizational standards she considered fundamental to the maintenance of social order. Every passenger who entered her air jurisdiction was unwittingly subjected to an anthropological scrutiny that catalogued shoes, watches, posture, diction, and dozens of other cultural markers that revealed, in her view, a person's true station in the social cosmos. The London-Los Angeles flight carried its usual cargo of financial tycoons, European aristocrats, and Hollywood celebrities whom Caroline had learned to serve with the professional deference their positions demanded. But there was also that middle category, nouveau riches who could afford first-class accommodation but lacked the cultural sophistication that, in Caroline's mind, legitimized such privilege. It was a distinction she considered not only relevant, but morally significant. Money without refinement represented a corrosion of the values that underpinned Western civilization. When the passenger in seat 2A boarded, Caroline immediately felt a dissonance that set off all her social alarms. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, with tousled blonde hair that suggested Californian insouciance, and wearing jeans that, while clearly expensive, exuded a casualness that she found inappropriate for first class. Even more disturbing was the necklace that hung around his neck, a simple silver chain with a pendant that looked handcrafted, completely out of place in the world of fine jewelry that Caroline associated with proper first-class passengers. Paul Walker settled into his seat with the ease of someone genuinely unaware of the unwritten social protocols that govern this space. He had chosen this particular necklace for the trip not for its monetary value, but for its deep emotional significance. It was a gift from his daughter Meadow, which she had created in a craft class when she was 8 years old, a labor of childhood love that represented the purest connection of his life. For Paul, the necklace served as a fatherly talisman, constantly reminding him that behind all the cinematic chases and spectacular explosions, his true identity lay in being the father of a girl who loved him not for what he did, but for who he was. Caroline watched the passenger with growing irritation as he removed a battered book from his backpack, something about child psychology and emotional development, and settled in for what was clearly going to be a long reading spree. The almost ascetic simplicity of his belongings contrasted sharply with the ostentatious standards she had come to expect of proper first-class passengers. There was no Hermes laptop, no Patek Philippe watch, none of the usual signs of affluence that validated one's presence in this exclusive space. During the initial phase of the flight, Caroline performed her duties with professional efficiency, but her irritation grew with each interaction with the mysterious passenger. When she offered him Dom Perignon champagne, he politely declined, asking only for water. When she presented the beluga caviar menu, he opted for the plain salad. Each choice reinforced her suspicion that she was dealing with someone who had gained access to this environment through questionable means, perhaps accumulated airline miles or a last-minute promotion. The final straw came when Caroline noticed the passenger adjusting her necklace, the handmade pendant catching the light from the windows in a way she found particularly offensive. The obvious simplicity of the piece, clearly handmade, probably costing less than a drink in the airport lounge, represented everything she considered wrong with the democratization of modern luxury. "Excuse me, sir," Caroline said, approaching with the professional smile that masked decades of refined condescension, "but I need to inform you of our first-class personal appearance policies. Paul looked up from his book, genuinely surprised by the interruption. "Sure, how can I help you?" The politeness of his response only intensified Caroline's irritation. People who truly belonged to the first class did not show such deference. To servants, they simply assumed that everyone around them existed to serve their needs. "Well," Caroline continued, her voice assuming the tone she had perfected to communicate authority without overt rudeness, "our first-class clientele has certain expectations about standards of presentation. This type of accessory," she gestured discreetly to the necklace, "might be considered inappropriate for the setting." Paul looked down, instinctively touching the pendant his daughter had made. "This necklace? Is there anything specific wrong with it?" "It's not exactly the sort of jewelry our regular passengers would wear," Caroline explained, each word carefully chosen to be demeaning without creating grounds for formal complaint. "We'd prefer it if you kept it on for the rest of the flight to maintain the appropriate atmosphere." The words struck Paul in a way Caroline couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't just about the necklace, it was about what it represented. Meadow had spent hours creating the piece, proudly explaining how she'd chosen each bead, how she'd learned to tie the special knot that held it all together. For Paul, wearing the necklace was a way to carry his daughter's love with him wherever he went, especially on long trips that kept them apart. "This necklace," Paul said calmly, but with a firmness Caroline hadn't expected, "has very significant sentimental value to me. I will not remove it." The outright refusal violated all of Caroline's expectations about how questionable passengers should respond to authority. People who truly didn't belong in that space typically cowered when confronted, apologizing and conforming immediately. "Sir," Caroline said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "I'm trying to be diplomatic here. Our other passengers have paid significant amounts for a specific experience, and part of that experience is the maintenance of certain standards." Paul closed his book and looked directly at Caroline. "And what standards exactly is my necklace violating?" The direct question forced Caroline to articulate prejudices that worked best when they remained implicit. "Well, it's obviously handmade, probably cost very little, and it just doesn't align with the caliber of fittings we expect to see in first class." "So you're saying that the monetary value of a piece determines whether it's appropriate?" Paul asked, his voice holding that calm quality that Caroline was beginning to interpret as disguised arrogance. "I'm saying that certain things have their proper place," Caroline replied, feeling increasingly frustrated by the unexpected resistance. "And frankly, your overall presentation suggests that perhaps you're not completely familiar with first-class conventions." It was the most direct humiliation Caroline had ever articulated, and she hoped it would finally break the troubled passenger's resistance. Instead, Paul smiled, not with embarrassment or anger, but with something close to sadness. "I see," Paul said softly. "You look at me and see someone who doesn't belong here." "It's not personal," Caroline replied quickly. "But yes, some passengers occasionally need guidance on expectations." Paul nodded thoughtfully. "May I ask what specifically about my appearance suggests I don't belong here?" The question was a trap, and Caroline knew it, but 15 years of professional conditioning compelled her to answer with brutal honesty. "Your clothes are very casual. You don't carry any of the accessories we associate with, well, people who fly first class regularly, and frankly, your general demeanor doesn't demonstrate familiarity with this environment." "Attitude?" Paul asked, genuinely curious. People who genuinely belong to first class don't ask so many questions. They just assume they will be accommodated. It was an observation that revealed more about Caroline's own insecurities than any objective truth about upper-class behavior, but she delivered it with the confidence of someone who had spent decades observing social norms. Paul considered her words for a moment. "Caroline," he said, reading her name on the pin, "can I tell you a story?" Caroline hesitated. Extended conversations with questionable passengers were not part of her preferred protocol. But something about Paul's tone intrigued her despite herself. "A few years ago," Paul began, "I was in Haiti after the earthquake, working with a relief organization that helps in disaster zones. I met a woman named Marie who had lost her home, her business, almost everything she owned. Caroline frowned, unsure of where the story was going. Marie wore a necklace. Paul continued, made from flattened bottle caps and wire found in the rubble. To any outside observer, it was trash, but she told me that each cap represented a day her family had survived after the earthquake. It was the most valuable thing she owned. Caroline felt a growing unease, as if the narrative was heading toward a conclusion that would force her to reconsider perspectives she preferred to keep unquestioned. What struck me, Paul said, touching his own necklace again, was how I had initially judged Marie's necklace based on its appearance, just as you are judging mine. But the real value wasn't in the material, it was in the meaning. That's a touching example, Caroline replied defensively, but we're talking about service standards in a specific commercial environment. We're talking about how we decide people's worth based on external symbols, Paul corrected gently, and how sometimes our judgments say more about us than about the people we're judging. The words carried a weight that made Caroline feel inexplicably exposed. Sir, with all due respect, you know nothing about my background or experience. You're right, Paul agreed, just as you don't know anything about mine. For example, you don't know that this necklace was made by my 8-year-old daughter, or that it's one of the most precious things I own, or that wearing it reminds me that being a father is more important than any professional role I might have. Caroline felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the armor of certainty she had built up over decades. I didn't know. How could you know? Paul asked without malice. You looked at me and saw jeans and a simple necklace, and you based your entire assessment on those superficial details. The accusation implicit in Paul's remark forced Caroline to confront the fundamental nature of how she navigated the world, cataloging people through material symbols and assuming that those symbols revealed essential truths about character and worth. But that doesn't change the fact, Caroline said, struggling to maintain her ideological position, that certain expectations exist in this environment. Expectations based on what? Paul asked. The idea that money automatically translates into human worth? That expensive accessories indicate moral superiority? Caroline opened her mouth to respond but found that she had no argument that didn't ring hollow when articulated explicitly. Caroline, Paul said softly, can I ask you a personal question? She nodded reluctantly. Why did you choose to work in aviation, originally, before all the considerations about standards and protocols? The question caught Caroline completely, off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked her about her original motivations before they were buried under layers of professional conditioning? I wanted to travel, she admitted. See the world, meet different people. When I was a kid, I used to dream about all the interesting people I would meet. And did you meet interesting people? Caroline considered the question. Some, she admitted. But you've developed filters that determine which people deserve your attention based on what? Their accessories? The observation hit Caroline like a punch in the gut. She had indeed developed filters, had created a system of categorization that protected her emotional energy, but also isolated her from genuine human connections. It's not that simple, Caroline protested. When you work with the public for so long, you have to develop protections. Protections against what? Well, Caroline struggled to articulate fears she rarely consciously examined. Against people who might take advantage of you, or who don't respect your professionalism, or that might force you to question the categories you use. To understand the world, Paul suggested gently. The observation was so accurate that Caroline felt as if Paul had some kind of access to her inner psychology. Maybe, she admitted reluctantly. Carolyn, Paul said, can I tell you something I've learned from working in disaster zones? She nodded, now genuinely curious. The most impressive people I met were often those I initially dismissed as insignificant. Community leaders who dressed like manual laborers, doctors who looked like refugees, children who carried wisdom that put formally educated adults to shame. Caroline absorbed the words, feeling something fundamental shift in her understanding of how she navigated social interactions. "What I'm trying to say," Paul continued, "is that when we use appearance as a proxy for value, we miss opportunities to connect with people who could enrich our lives in unexpected ways." "But surely," Caroline argued, "some level of social discrimination is necessary. We can't treat everyone the same in every context." "You're right," Paul agreed. "But there's a difference between maintaining professional standards and using those standards to diminish other people's humanity." The distinction Paul was making forced Caroline to examine her own motivations in ways she had avoided for years. How much of her behavior was about genuinely maintaining standards of service, and how much was about maintaining a social hierarchy that made her feel superior? "May I ask," Caroline said hesitantly, "what do you do professionally? For your job, I mean." Paul smiled. "I'm an actor, mostly action movies. Nothing too intellectually sophisticated." The answer created further confusion for Caroline. Hollywood actors definitely qualified for first class in her social taxonomy, but Paul had not demonstrated any of the behaviors she associated with celebrities. "You don't act like I would expect an actor to act," she admitted. "How would you expect me to act?" Caroline realized she was being forced to articulate stereotypes that worked best when they remained unconscious. More demanding, more concerned with status, more aware of her own importance. "And why would you assume that being an actor would make me any of those things?" The question forced Caroline to confront the arbitrary nature of many of her social categorizations. "I suppose that's what the media suggests about people in your profession. So you're judging people based on media stereotypes about their professions, in addition to judging them based on appearance." Caroline felt completely exposed. Every answer she gave revealed another layer of unconscious bias that had operated her entire life without question. "Paul," she said, using his name for the first time, "may I apologize?" "For what specifically?" The question forced Caroline to be specific about her transgressions rather than offer a generic excuse. "For assuming you didn't belong here based on your appearance, for trying to force you to change something personally meaningful to you, and for using my position to make you feel lesser." Paul nodded, accepting the apology. "Thank you. That means a lot. May I ask why you were so patient with me? Most people would have gotten angry or demanded to speak to a supervisor." Paul considered the question. "Because I recognized something in you that I see in myself sometimes, the tendency to use filters to simplify a world that is more complex than we would like it to be, and because I believe that most people are capable of growth when presented with perspectives that challenge their assumptions." Caroline felt tears welling up, the first time she had cried at work in her entire career. "You changed something for me today," she admitted, "about how I think about people. And you gave me a gift too," Paul replied. "Like this? You reminded me that when I wear this necklace," he touched the pendant again, "I am not just carrying my daughter's love. I am carrying the responsibility to represent that love in a way that honors what she invested in creating it." Caroline understood that Paul was referring to something deeper than jewelry. He was talking about how our most important connections call us to be better versions of ourselves. "Can I ask you one final question?" Caroline asked. "Of course." "How can I do it differently? How can I serve people without putting them down?" Paul smiled. "Maybe by starting each interaction with curiosity instead of judgment. Wondering what story each person carries, instead of assuming you already know based on how they present themselves." Caroline nodded, understanding that she was getting more than professional advice. She was getting a master class in human empathy. The rest of the flight passed in relative tranquility, but Caroline found herself observing other passengers with different eyes. The man in the expensive-looking suit who treated staff with contempt. The woman in the obviously expensive jewelry who constantly complained about substandard services. The young couple in plain clothes who shared headphones as they watched movies together. clearly enjoying an experience they had probably saved up a lot to pay for. As the plane landed at LAX, Caroline approached Paul one last time. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For teaching me that real service is about elevating people, not categorizing them." Paul smiled and extended his hand. "It was nice meeting you, Caroline. Really." As passengers disembarked, Caroline remained on the plane for a few extra minutes, processing a conversation that had fundamentally changed how she understood her work and, more broadly, how she navigated human relationships. 6 months later, Caroline had become known among her colleagues as the flight attendant who treated each passenger as if they were the most important person on the plane. When asked about the change in her approach, she often mentioned a conversation with a fellow passenger who had taught her that true luxury lies not in excluding people, but in making each person feel genuinely valued. When Paul Walker died in 2013, Caroline read about his philanthropic activities with a deeper understanding of the man she had met on that flight. She realized that his humility had not been performative, it was simply who he was, and his patience with her that morning had been an example of leading by example, turning a moment of conflict into an opportunity for growth. In later interviews about service excellence, Caroline often said, "I learned that when you serve people, you're not just offering a product or an experience, you're offering human dignity, and dignity isn't something some people deserve more than others, it's something we all deserve simply for being human." The story of Meadows' necklace has become something of an urban legend among British Airways cabin crew, a reminder that behind every passenger is a story we will never fully know, and that our job is not to judge those stories, but to honor them through service that recognizes the inherent humanity in every person we encounter. Paul Walker had taught Caroline Whitmore that carrying love, whether in the form of a handmade necklace or any other symbol, is an act of courage that deserves respect, not ridicule, and that when we witness someone carrying love in this way, our responsibility is not to diminish them, but to protect and honor them as the sacred treasure that they truly are.